I'm gonna start a little bit with Atlas, right? Like we both decided it would be good to spend some time with it, and I have like two layers of relationships with it. One is kind of when I first encountered it, it was as a website. Like when you think about it as a website, it's extremely confusing. Like I think I needed to suspend something about like being on a browser and like attempting to find information for me to be able to enjoy it. And it was only when I went just back and forth exploring the different, I mean, for people that haven't seen it yet, I would recommend the best thing to do is just click the link and try it for their own kind of pleasure. Maybe I would do a screen recording to attach it to that actually later. It could be fun.
Yeah.
But there are different nodes, right? Like there are approaches, considerations, examples, and connections. And this is how people get to encounter, right?
Yeah.
At least encounter the knowledge. Yeah.
I think if I was to start all over again with the design, I didn't do the design. That was by the wonderful Tamara Leiters in Geneva. But we threw everything together in a pretty short amount of time. The main two sections, I think, are going to be approaches and considerations. The other two that sort of are presented equally as sort of additional things. But it started with an idea to pool and collect all the formats, and so approaches, practical approaches to making live work, performance work, anything that we can consider live in terms of artworks. That those kind of works that can somehow travel without the artist. So obviously relevant to those pandemic times, but something that both Caroline in Vidy and I were busy with already because of air travel contributing to climate change and climate breakdown and so on. It's been a little while that I haven't been taking flights, but it's been a much longer time that I've been making work that can operate like this. And she's in touch with a lot of different artists as a producer and curator of performance, and interested in those formats as well. And so we thought, well, this is a good time to try and pool them, to try and bring them all together. And we thought it would be a good idea to put together a working group to try and do this collectively and from a sort of global perspective, very carefully trying to bring as many people to the table as possible. So we had someone from Kenya, Shiva, who we know from Bangalore, Ophelia Huang from Shanghai, Gundega Laiviņa, who's Latvian but was based in the USA at the moment, and different. Well, they're all listed there. I'm not going to go through them all, but you know, it's a bit from everywhere. And one of the first things that happened was that there was this realization that to pool just the formats, much as that was interesting and obviously going to be useful, kind of wasn't enough. That there were so many questions, so many problems, and potential issues and implications of working like this, that we needed to compile those as well. And then we had the idea of, well, if we compile the formats, so kind of practical stuff, and we compile the questions and considerations, and we have basically practice and theory, what happens when we put those together? So what happens if you take one format and then you scan the questions and you're like, oh, you know what, this question is kind of interesting in relation to that format. And it creates this sort of third space, which is a thinking space, a working space. And there's somewhere you can, I mean, of course you can work however you like at home, but there's something you can write into there. So it sort of encourages this working tool aspect and different ideas. And you can sort of come at it from two ways. So either you have your own practice maybe as an artist, and you're thinking, how does it fit in relation to, you know, what are the formats that are available, other people that have explored, or what are the questions I should be asking myself about this, you know, ways of putting your up.
Was it geared to like artists predominantly, or
well, like I said, there's two ways.
Audience?
So there's sort of two ways. You can bring your own ideas and working considerations and things you're busy with to it and have it put against these things, or you can go in and get inspiration and then come out with ideas. And similarly for academics or producers, anyone busy with the live arts, really. Also the audience, for sure.
Exactly, because I think that was also one of the encounters that when I first saw, I think it was the Approaches kind of matrix where you see like protests, guided tours, scores, dance. Like when you see these things, you also, I think one of the kind of the speculations that I had was it was an interesting proposal for remote performance where we were having a lot of conversations during lockdown where do you perform over Zoom? How do people move? And I thought that showing without going in my head it was going nowhere. Like you were getting as if you were getting ingredients. And then you as an audience could imagine performance. So instead of bringing the artist on Zoom, which was something that a lot of artists didn't want to do, of course, people that wanted to engage with the medium before kept doing that. But there was something there that was interesting where what is this performance that is going to be completely compiled by the audience, which is also something that you bring up in the matrix itself, which is audience responsibility, right? I mean, I found that very curious. Like, do you have any people coming up and saying that the tool itself was a performance, or was it used as a performance writing tool?
Yeah, well, like I say, I feel a bit short on responses from the whole thing, especially now at this point. We got a lot of nice responses, and in my workshops with it, and there's been all sorts of things that have come out of it, but those are primarily with artists or students and so on. So short answer, no. But yeah, I do think that ultimately what's nice is that it proposes a whole bunch of imaginative approaches to thinking about liveness in general and what the possibilities are and the potentials. It's not trying to propose only solutions to a problem. It's sort of saying, well, this way of working is anyway interesting. Here are the people who've been doing it for years, and here are some of the things that have come out of it. And how else can we conceive of and think of live culture? And for example, protest is going to be part of it. And it sounds like the kind of projects you're doing are also thinking in an expanded way about it. I mean, for me, for years, it's always been just really knowing that I'm interested in the here and now, and in the kind of work that doesn't necessarily want to be representational and say, oh, we're in Russia in the 18th century, but rather here are the walls, we're doing something in front of you, or something's happening between your hands, or between two people, or between thousands of people in the street. This thought of what can you do live that cannot be done in any other medium, or what needs to be live, what requires liveness. That's what's interesting to me, and that's why it was so important to us, I feel, to sort of start doing the Atlas during the pandemic, because you had theatre people kind of in a bit of a panic and just throwing up their shows, of like recordings of a theatre show online, expecting people to pay a ticket and watch it on their laptop, which apparently was happening, but it didn't really make much sense to me. I certainly didn't want to do that. And so actually the laptop thing was interesting. I mean, I was thinking, like, what's the difference between that, like a recording of a show on a laptop, and a live work involving a voice coming out of a laptop, maybe even a picture of someone speaking on a laptop, but which creates an event in a room when you walk in and see it happening. Like, and it's in a way, it's that line, it was quite useful to me. I kept going back to it, like the event of a machine with a screen producing presence, or producing something that demands you witness it in a way, and instead of something that sets up the screen and does the usual thing that we know from TV or whatever screen-based stuff, that just sucks you into the representational thing. So for me, that was a when I thought of that, I started doing little things with just my computer at home, or even just a phone, actually, a voice coming out of a phone. I put it in a saucepan. Like I put the voice in a saucepan, and then I thought, why not do two? So I had two phones, one on the table and one on the floor in a saucepan. This is the kind of pandemic things that people like us got.
So there's that and making bread.
And so there was a conversation between the two phones, and the phone was like, what are you doing down there in the saucepan? And the phone was like, honestly, I don't really know. Someone put me here. And the one on the table was like, yeah, I see the lid is slightly off. Does that give you enough space to breathe? You feel good like that? And it was funny seeing that happen. But to me, it was amusing to think that, you know, it was a variation on all this other stuff, representational stuff, that is using the same tools, using the screen and the speakers that these machines have, but somehow rather, you know, doing the live thing that we're interested in.
Do you think that this project, kind of, at least from like a personal practice perspective, was it responding to something that you considered urgent, or did you see that moment as a possibility of like collecting people coming in together? I mean, was that something that was coming? Because I'm also comparing it to probably the larger conversations that's going to be happening with a lot of initiatives coming in to fill or solve. You're saying that it was not, which I find interesting to also put on the table. Like, it's not an urgent project, right? I mean, it wasn't.
Well, I mean, it was in some ways solving things. I mean, I like to think that for some people, it was like, oh, okay, yeah, there is really a lot more possibilities here than I thought. I like to think that, especially in the kind of Anglosphere of theatre makers, that where I sense the panic and the most keenly, I like to think that it opened things up a bit in the conversation. And certainly when we launched it, that's the response that I was getting. So yeah, in some ways it was solving things, but I meant that you know, within the impulse to do it, what people were saying a lot, especially Gundega, actually, she was really great in articulating this, is that it wasn't just about solving problems, and we can think of many of these formats as interesting in their own rights, taken aside from any global public health crisis that we're in, and mainly, I mean, honestly, for me, I saw it all as a rehearsal for further catastrophes and further instances of not being able to move around as we wish. I mean, to me, it's no big surprise that people are just getting back on planes now and continuing as normal. But I don't think that it will be very long until we're faced with something else like that. And certainly an expansion of what's possible in the public realm to do with liveness and cultural practices involving the here and now, and a deep understanding of what you can do, that feels urgent, absolutely. Sharing tactics and all sorts of things. I mean, so I was kind of hoping to link the Atlas to, you know, a more explicitly activist tender people who were able to come in with that angle and that expertise as well. Yeah.
Okay, and so I just want to clarify something. This, I think, like when you're mentioning this, like future catastrophe, I do see that this is relevant now, even before like the future catastrophe happened, right? Like, is there?
I mean, I say future catastrophe is happening now. I'm talking about climate breakdown, and of course, there's people all over the planet already affected by it and unable to. Well, mostly the people who anyway were not getting on planes. So yeah, it's.
But do you see mobility as like a main mover of this project still?
Well, I think it's the easiest way to crystallize it, because for people involved in liveness, involved in live practices, it's usually a given that you have to be there to do that practice. Most of it is, you know, it's especially in the theatre world, it's very unusual to be kind of sending things and without being there yourself. And so, yeah, that's why I think it's a useful way of crystallizing it in people's minds. It's like, well, what can you do without going? Or how can you go in different ways than you're used to?
I think, like, I'm not very sure of what I'm going to say now, but my question is, it's come from two places, because I see this as a very political project. One, it's definitely political and has political implications, but also at the same time, in terms of performance design in this place of the virtual, which is now there regardless if there's a constrained mobility or not. There's something interesting there. I mean, in the prompts, you already have non-human participants. You have kind of different conversations or recipients, audiences split into many versions of audiences or formats. Like, you have the audience that's responsible, you have the audience that's just listening, the audience that's participating. I'm just wondering what the future of this project can be if you're going to articulate a little bit, if you're going to speak about it as a tool that exists, like a performance tool that exists, regardless of constrained mobility. Is this something that would be interesting for you, or? Yeah,
I think that in a way, the Atlas, from my side, is, I mean, my work there is done. There's so much there in terms of that can be useful for people now. What I think is interesting is for other practitioners, especially people like yourself who are doing things explicitly to do with the impossibility of certain people coming together, for example, taking specific projects like that, and then for example, you could see which of the considerations or questions there are applicable or interesting or confronting even for that project, or helpful. It's like it's basically just a container and a vessel for people's activity now and contributions. So
is it like because yesterday I was trying to like formulate a couple of connections, right? And it was fun because I start on one end, I started with really not knowing what the hell I'm doing. I was just connecting things that have nothing to do with my practice, just imagining what could happen. And I like that I realized later that there's this possibility of adding a connection to the roster of connections that exist, and also the possibility of commenting. But I feel like maybe it's just like a technical thing right now where I don't know where the contribution went, or like how I can connect others. Like, is this something that's gonna happen? Is this something?
Yeah,
because this is one way of
moderated. They simply need to be moderated. So it takes a few days for someone to see that.
Okay, so people can still add to it right now.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going there. Maybe. Well, to begin with, I was going there once a week. I must say that recently it's been more like twice a month instead. But eventually, I'll see it. I'll go, oh great, someone's contributed, and it'll get added to the Atlas. Absolutely, yeah.
And is there a reason why the contributions are not credited? I don't think they were, right? I forgot.
No, probably because they're mostly by us so far, and we didn't feel like we needed to. But I
was just wondering
they probably should be if they're coming from other people. But it would be up to the contributor.
Yeah, I found it both interesting and like a question. I thought I was wondering if it's intentional, because part of it makes a lot of sense for it to be like a cloud of connections where people are throwing in without necessarily stamping it. But I also thought that I would be curious to know like who made what, or where they're from, or why they're doing it, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the whole question of because I would also be curious, so it's nice if people put their names, but at the same time, we wanted to kind of leave this open as a kind of resource, kind of common resource. But I mean, it's easy, especially something that's kind of funded by the Swiss Prohelvetia Council. It's easy to kind of request things from people in a way that feels extractivist or whatever. So on the other hand, the whole thing is, I think, quite generous as something that's just put out there for free for people to use. So, you know, it's like, if you feel like contributing, that's fine. Otherwise, by all means, you know, take what we've made and make use of it in your own way. It's that's basically the spirit of it. I mean, even the examples that are there of other people's work, there was a lot of back and forth about that. We really didn't want it to seem, because there was a lot of misunderstanding about that initially. We didn't want it to seem like like we were trying to make a catalogue of all the existing works, like, you know, by artists in alphabetical order or something, because that would be impossible. And it was really not that we were trying to do. The examples are there as examples of formats, regardless of what we think of them. So there's no judgment there about whether it's a good or bad piece or anything. They're just there.
No, they're very helpful. I think it would have been hard to navigate if I hadn't seen, like, it was a lot of back and forth between the approaches and the connections, and then going back to your own dashboard. It's helpful to see how these things have connected. There's
there's a lot of stuff there that's there just to make it concrete, really. As you know, for example, you know, we talk about animatronics, and it's useful to be able to refer to Stefan Kegi's piece with the robot version of the Thomas Meller writer, you know, because there you have something more. It's not just like a robot on stage being entertaining. It's like there's a concept behind it, like the reason why somebody living was made into a robot and so on, as well as a lot of interesting questions about touring, like how much does it cost to tour, what kind of company gets to make a show like that, a whole lots of other, you know, many other things there. I mean, if we could have done, it would have been nice to have like a more, you know, something that tends towards the exhaustive in its categorizing of what's out there, but that would have been an enormous job and very quickly out of date. So whereas I think the Atlas with its questions right now will probably continue to be relevant for some time, even with the insane pace of technology that we're witnessing at the moment.
And is it, how do you, like, is the sustainability from a growth perspective, is it something that you're considering different strategies for the Atlas, or you'd like it to remain a resource as is? Like, is there something that you didn't explore yet with it that you would like it to have? Or
I mean, there's changes that I would love to make to it, but there's unfortunately no more money left to do that, like for the web design and all that kind of thing. I only hope that the hosting will continue for some time. That's the main thing. But it's there are small things to do, especially to do with the design, but and maybe also to make it a little bit less overwhelming for people who come to it the first time, because I guess we lose maybe quite a lot of people. Probably people need to be sort of led by the hand a bit more the first time, which is what I do when I use it in my workshops. So that's a little bit of a tricky thing, but no, I mean, it's interesting. Like it relates a lot also to, I mean, it relates a lot to my own work, and I kind of constantly go back to it personally to check things against it. I keep accidentally falling into this way of work. Probably it's just kind of like an inertia now, a sort of series of movements that lead me back to the same place. But I'm also discovering new ways of doing it every time. And like recently, I did a project that I had no idea what the format would be, which is very unusual for me, because I usually start with being inspired in a way by a format, like like if I had an idea, you could have headphones on two people and the headphones would tell them what to say. Boom, there's a show, and I wanted to explore that, and that takes me down a certain alleyway. Or if I find out about glass reflecting in such a way that you can have images seemingly appeering over the face of someone on the other side of the glass, then I think, maybe there's something to look at there. Whereas here, I did a journey with a friend that didn't go according to plan, and sent me in a direction that where I was faced with the refugee crisis on a Greek island and ended up in Turkey. A lot of different things, a lot of different strands. And I didn't know what the format would be. And I ended up writing something, a kind of lecture performance. So it took that format initially of slideshow, basically, and a text. I showed that to some workshop students in Istanbul. And then afterwards, because the response was strong, I made it into a little film, which again, I never do usually. I don't really work with video or film, but I did that for my own purposes, just to fix the material. And I showed it to then my friend David Berger here in Athens. And he said he could imagine this as a book. And I said, well, I can't, because I'm not really particularly interested in books. My thing is liveness. And he said, but don't you want to make a book, and do you not want to co-direct a new imprint with me? He said, because he's having quite a lot of success with publishing at the moment. And then I thought, well, maybe if it was a book with a soundtrack, then in a way it would be an interesting variation on a slideshow. In fact, it might be more interesting than a lecture performance. Something kind of more intimate. And we thought about it more, and we thought, actually, post-pandemic, now that everyone knows what to do with a QR code, and now that it's no longer too pretentious or problematic to assume that people have a smartphone and a pair of headphones, actually, it's quite an interesting time to think that a book can suddenly be, in a more normal way, more than just a book, or sort of hyperlinking out into other formats, into sound or potentially video. But particularly the combination of sound and printed matter suddenly became interesting to us, and so we've actually started we're starting a new publication series of books called time-based editions, where each one is an experience of a certain time, where you're led through the book by a soundtrack, a guide telling you when to turn the page in some way or other, telling you that, or guiding you through. And so I'm releasing the first one soon, and we'll be talking to other artists about we're seeing how that draws people in, and putting out different books in the future. So it's there it's like, for me, it's a live thing. We're presenting it as events where everyone's 25, 50 people are sitting with a book together at the same time, with the sound coming out of speakers around them. And it's available also as books to buy in bookshops. So the thing can exist on these two levels, and always triggering this kind of a book that activates a performance.
That's very interesting. I mean, I imagined it as something that is outside of events, but it's interesting that you're doing it with both, because just this, it goes back to also your personal work, which I'm just slightly familiar with, because I was like looking it up in addition to Showing Without Going. And I was looking at Etiquette, the project, and it seemed like something that I actually have a question that relates to that book project about. And you mentioned that there are showing times for Etiquette, right? Like different languages, different showing times. Is it something that is timed or not?
Yeah. Well, the piece is simply, it's for two people to do in a cafe. And usually it's almost always presented by theatre festivals or organizations off-site, or perhaps it's the cafe of the theatre or something like that. And it's for two at a time. So we would usually have 3 tables set up in a cafe, but there's no one else watching, right? So you have the cafe functioning as normal, and 2 people sit down, wear the headphones, and it's 2 iPods that are started at the same time with different audio, but running in sync. So
okay, so they're not personal devices. The devices are part of the. Okay.
Yeah, they've always been little iPods that we provide with the audio on them, so that people don't have to start kind of fiddling around with their own phones. but I mean, it's a very old piece. We made it in 2007, where it was unthinkable that people would use their own.
That's why I think like the fact that etiquette came before this showing without going, and what showing without going wants to offer, and also with that publication project, it feels like these projects are kind of yearning for each other in a way. I mean, now I totally imagine the etiquette project being done without a showing time, right? I mean, it could happen because
when you say showing
etiquette.
But what is a showing time for you? What does that mean?
Because I think when I was reading on the website, let me double check again. The piece you can ask for any of these versions whenever it's happening. So I assumed there was a schedule.
Yes, a schedule as in, so it's presented in a theatre festival during, and usually
exactly.
it'll be running through the day.
When we think,
so you would book a slot. You would, I mean, usually people would buy a ticket. Let's say you do the 3:30 p.m. slots. So you show up, you and your friend, and you're
this is
sat
what got
down.
me thinking. Now you're saying like this was 2007, right? But now, after all this conversation and these projects and these live explorations, I would imagine it is something that could be, you can buy it online with a friend on your phone and do it. And that's why I was,
Right. Well, that's interesting. I mean, theoretically it's possible. That performance also has quite a few particular little props that we bring. So objects on the table. So we would have to provide all that. But it's interesting because when we first made it, Silvia and I, this was a collaboration with Silvia Mercuriali, who I had a company with for 10 years called Rotozaza. That was our last piece together, and kind of also the one that kickstarted a whole lot of other work in the same vein that we call Théâtre. And when we first made it, we were like, what kind of an economy are we in, or what kind of an industry is this? Is this theatre still, or should we be talking to, for example, video artists about how that works? And very quickly, I started understanding that basically the visual art world is a completely different thing to the theatre world. I mean, I was still quite young at the time, and it led me to very quickly having a lot of faith in the framing of live shows by theatres and so on, where you go to a place at a certain time because you bought a ticket. There's a big problem with, I mean, basically I have a lot of other people's work that I've downloaded on my laptop that I've still never done, because you can do it whenever you like. And much as it's kind of attractive, the thought that, you can just kind of distribute things like that, especially when it's kind of free and easy, it just doesn't really get done, and it's sort of, there's no sense of event around it. So so we have always really rather kind of stuck to the model of like the theatres who do the job of finding a context and making the festival and building an audience. But that's where the book thing is interesting, because people are used to buying books and opening them and doing the job of decoding the words that are written on the page and conjuring liveness, which is really what happens when you read a good book. And what we're doing with the time-based editions is kind of trying to access that world at the same time as also continuing the relationship with theatres and presenting it in that way as well. Yeah, it's tricky otherwise. I mean, there's different ways of going about it. Also during the pandemic, I got involved with, for the first time, making an app. And that was interesting as well, because it was together with somebody who's kind of used to, I mean, his modus operandi was, it can only work if certain number of million people download the app within the time that it gets launched. It's like the sort of Silicon Valley thing of being funded by angels and stuff. It was all new to me.
Yeah.
And surprise, surprise, it didn't work. Maybe the material was too esoteric. But
what was the app supposed to do?
I need to backtrack a little bit in order to explain, if you don't mind. It's all relevant. But one of the autoteatro pieces that I've made in the last years that I started making hit was called Not to Scale, and it's very similar to etiquette. It's two people sat side by side, each have a piece of paper, a pencil, and an eraser, and you each have headphones telling you what to do. And this was a collaboration with the great Tim Etchells, and it's the third piece that he and I have made together. Tim Etchells, I don't know if you know his work, or he's the director of Forced Entertainment, and I don't think I'm alone in being very inspired over the years by his work. He's one generation above me, and the work with Forced Ents and his own individual work is enormously inspiring. And he's always been very strong with thinking about language and thinking about the edges of language, what language can do, where it can't do anything anymore, where it breaks down, all sorts of things to do with the power play of language, and also mark making. And we'd done a piece in 2010 called The Quiet Volume, which was a lot about silent reading. Same situation, also two people sat next to each other, but in library reading rooms, public all around you, people who are using the library for their own purposes, and a whispered soundtrack that leads you through a stack of novels, but also to ring-bound things that we made. And these are full-length pieces, 1 hour. The Not to Scale was the third piece that we made, an idea that we had all the way back in 2010 when we were doing this other one. And there was a challenge there because the voice is telling you what to draw, right? And the challenge was not to have the voice get boring, because basically you have to say quite a lot to get anything happening on the page. That's where the event is, at least initially. And we really wanted to make things happen, but we found there was a kind of lot of, you felt your chain was being yanked rather easily, you know, and we try and make that as light as possible. I think in the end we got there, but while we were thinking about ways to do this, I was having ideas about how to cheat in a way that were not relevant to this project. But one of them, I thought, that's interesting, and I sort of put it on the side. And the idea was to put a piece of paper on an iPad or on some kind of screen where a little light would appear behind it, and you put a pen or a pencil and just follow that dot as it moves. And while you're listening to something that's played on over headphones, and gradually something appears, which of course then leaves a trace. And it was interesting to me on all sorts of different levels, also as a kind of act of resistance in a way to the screen. You know, just to put a piece of paper over a screen felt nice, and I thought it would be, you know, even just to kind of, yeah, I mean, this is very germane to the screen fatigue theme, but I thought even just as a kind of conceptual joke, you know, to put out an app on the App Store where the first thing you have to do is put a piece of paper over it, so you can't see anything. Quite like that. So I thought, you know, and I pitched it to this Silicon Valley company, and they were like, yeah, this sounds good. Do you want to go with it? And they gave me amazingly a bunch of, you know, some money to develop this, which meant that I was then able to contact artists that I like and help them to pay their rent, which was not obvious at the time. And it was a pretty amazing little pandemic project that I was doing on the side. And we made maybe 10 or 12 little pieces like this that I'm very proud of. And I really love this material. And it went out, the app, and the millions did not download it immediately. And so after a while, he said, okay, so we're going to have to pull the plug on this. We also did do a children's version as well, which was enormously popular with the people who we tried it with. But again, I don't know where these millions are, but they didn't show up.
It's interesting. I think it should have been marketed as a mindfulness game. You would have.
Yeah. No, it's true that that's what they were strong on. There was all sorts of different avenues that it could have taken, but so that's, yeah, that was another sort of format of distribution that was interesting. I mean, you know, the idea that you could access that, and theoretically.
What year was that? What year was that project?
I mean, it was really during like the 2021 pandemic years.
So it was, okay.
Yeah, just now, yeah.
Yeah.
And we only really fully stopped it last year. Yeah. So
like extreme screen fatigue, like that was a good comeback. It's a good comeback to the screen fatigue idea. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the material is still there, and I'm interested in finding different ways of doing it. I mean, I think it's also a nice way of literally using screens that are tired. For example, screens that are not used anymore because the rest of the machine is out of date. So you have like monitors that you see in the streets, like because they have to be flat. And actually, it's fun to do it with a laptop. It's actually better with a laptop than with an iPad, because the iPad, you have to somehow block the touch screen. Whereas with a laptop, you turn it upside down. And that act as well felt kind of good. Like to see a laptop upside down with a screen flat on the table, with a piece of paper on it. And so that's the way that if I was to share this material with you, that's the way I would encourage you to do it. But taking an old large monitor from the street and sticking it on a table and putting a nice big A3 and not caring if you're using a permanent marker that might damage the screen. You know, all this, I like that. So at some point there will be probably a coming together of this material in an exhibition format or something like that.
I think like this is kind of also like I'm curious about this relationship with screens and mediated performance outside of screens altogether, or the web altogether. Are screens necessary for you for like remote projects or remote live performances?
Not usually, no, not usually. Like for example, this piece Not to Scale that I do with Tim with the pencil and paper and everything. That's one of my works that I can send, and it can be set up remotely. I usually do have a Zoom session with the festival so that I can explain to them how to set it up and stuff. So for that, a screen is used, but that's not really directly the piece itself. Otherwise, it's just I send them little iPods and the headphones, the right kind of headphones, and they set it up. I mean, I make it sound easy. There's a lot of details to making sure it goes right, but it's not really screen based. And most of my work has not involved video. Some of it has, but always trying to get beyond the screen. There was a piece I made called Q China that I mentioned it briefly. This idea of the kind of teleprompter piece of glass. I don't know if you know how that works. So you could be, it allows you to kind of maintain eye contact with something that's equidistant from the glass. So between me and you, there would be that. But you're reading words that are projected from somewhere else, from either above or below, and they appear to be further away. So, and I set up an installation so that the glass is in between us, and so I could see words over your eyes, and I can speak those words, and you speak words back to me, and you also have that. So it's this autoteatro format. And making it, I realized that I could also project other things over your face, and I found that interesting. And eventually it turned into a fantasy encounter with a person who was poisoned in one of the Foxconn factories making iPhones. I don't know if you remember that story. It was like way back in 2000. Now I have to be careful. 11, I think. There were about 34 factory workers that were horribly poisoned because the factory suddenly swapped out alcohol for some very toxic substance that would mean that the screens of iPhones can be cleaned about 3 seconds quicker, which meant that they could do more. And they had their central nervous systems kind of wrecked by it, and they went public with it. And of course, that meant that there was all sorts of problems. They were then offered benefit packages if they signed certain things saying they wouldn't complain anymore. Anyway, I reached out and I contacted one of these guys, and he arranged for a meeting with me and said he was okay to record for me to record the conversation. And using this long 4-hour conversation with him that I had with a translator, wherein I also explained my idea for the format and how I was going to sort of semi-fictionalize our encounter. I edited that and placed it within a kind of, this semi-fictional setup, so that
that people would also perform, or
well, perform in the sense that you basically just kind of donate your body to be inhabited by this fiction. So you're looking at me, I'm looking at you, and the narration basically creates a you out of the person sitting opposite. And the story is that you're you open up your laptop to upgrade its RAM or something. You want it to go a bit faster, and once you put it back together again, you restart it, and then suddenly there's this face looking at you, and it turns out it's this worker who just wants to kind of be there with you for a while, and then tell you a bit about where the computers come from and something about the process by which it's been put together. So it was a lot about also using the power of this laptop and sort of to question its own process of manufacture and how it ends up in front of you. And it was a lot of thinking about screens there as well, specifically because, he had been poisoned cleaning the screen, the flatness of the screen, and the flatness of victimhood, like how victims are very often perceived in this flat way by people who come to thinking about them through media, the flatness of the trap in a way of victimhood, in that it's very difficult to think of victims as people with either a sense of humor or a sense of curiosity. And I think certainly in the West, those are the kind of vectors by which we assess depth of personhood in a way. And when those things are taken away, it's kind of the first step towards people becoming non-people. And I feel like that sort of sense of absence of personhood is very linked with this trap of victimhood that piece specifically was trying to kind of talk about a bit or explore. And so there was a flatness there that went with the screens, and I think then also, then this idea of using our own volume, because we're here and now and live, to somehow let this person be present. And that's the point at which I think you were like, okay, that's why we use fiction here. Like, the idea was so a little bit preposterous, a bit wild and sci-fi to begin with. But you get to a place where you're like, oh, this really matters. And it's really important that this person has presence here in Amsterdam or New York City or wherever it was that I presented it. And that's why I was so interested in what you were saying about ways to bring these people together. I don't know if you want to recap that. Like these people, how can you bring those people together who could not be together? I mean, to me, that seems like one of the most urgent questions. Like how, what's the difference between someone dialing in from house arrest on Zoom and being somehow more physically present in a room? Like what and is also, that difference?
Like what you're saying, following up on that, I feel like, I'm not sure if it's an intentional kind of addition or parallel to the project, but I really find it interesting how you are, like, while you're flattening something, you're also completely unpacking the machine itself, where we're all looking at these like screens as facilitators, or the entire IT of everything as the messiah of how we can connect with each other, while in reality, the production of these machines is something that is very real, and it represents everything that we're trying to work against. But we work on these things, on these machines, and you have to confront it not just as a tool, but also as like an entire economic and social construct. So we are now speaking using a tool that is built over a lot of realities, and we need to acknowledge that. I think your project does a lot of that, in addition to showcasing the intentional flatness. But there's something that I find very curious, and now I'm just being evoked. My sentence isn't fully formulated, but it's also something that I felt with Showing Without Going, where there's kind of an invitation to look at the the infrastructure of what we're all trying to achieve, which is, okay, so let's say climate. What works are we doing to not further the catastrophe, but also while doing all of these works, we are furthering the catastrophe, and just trying to unpack all of these things and look at them. I find that super interesting, but also, I mean, this is what I would call the performance itself, and how I view or how I appreciate works. Like, speaking about the collaterals of the work itself is something that's very, very interesting. And also, I'm someone that completely was against performing things online or watching online performances, although sometimes I have to, either for work or like seeing friends' works. But what you're describing now, even before the Atlas, but also it links very much to it, is just a question mark on the possibilities of imagination, right? I mean, if we're all there trying to translate exactly what we're doing in remote practices, we're kind of doing almost nothing. We're just subscribing to a machine that is already subscribed to a prejudiced, unjust economic model. But what the platform does, or what Atlas does, and also what your projects kind of also evoke, whether intentionally or not, is the imagined possibilities of what could happen with prompts, right? Like, okay, you're going to give me something I'm very familiar with, a prompt, but then something is going to happen just because of the formulation that you're inviting me to imagine. And I find that very precious. Also, I mean, mostly in the Atlas, but also now that you speak more about the works, most of I'm not very familiar with, so I can't speak so much about, but I can only react to what you're saying. I like that a lot, like that, when what you're speaking about in terms of fiction and the necessary of that format, like half fiction. It is holding one's hand into like a request to imagine something. And I don't know, I just find that very valuable, especially when we're speaking about mobility. This is why, like, when I bring mobility back, I also wanna break it apart a little bit, because I feel like we focused on mobility a lot the past 2-3 years, and a lot of the works that have been done in that process, and even before, we're dealing with something that is much more complex, which is connection, right? And this is what we're trying to mediate also in this conversation. So this necessity to connect, the necessity to do something together, but also the impacts of mobility. I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, totally. I mean, I've got to say, in some ways, all these constraints set up by the pandemic were very inspiring artistically, and I guess it's no big surprise, because most people know that artists respond well to constraints, and or rather, you could also say, or look at it another way and say that when everything is possible, it's extremely depressing. Like, some of the best work is set up by very clear constraints, and so I don't know, speaking for myself, it was like, you know, I was half thinking, okay, here's a chance to really talk about the reality of climate breakdown and get real and start sort of denormalizing certain practices and things. And on the other hand, it was like, well, maybe we can even have some fun here, and you know, and bring a larger audience into these questions of what the difference is between screen-based work and kind of, you know, live work that involves screens. That doesn't even make sense. You know what I mean? Like what we were talking about earlier, like the work that sucks you into a screen, and work which employs the screen to somehow create something happening in the here and now. And there's all sorts of different ways of doing that. But yeah, it was about a lot more than just screens, and certainly bringing people together at a time when people were not allowed to be together. That was an interesting challenge, for sure. And there were so many different, I don't know, I feel like there's also, talking to friends as well, feels like that there's now tucked away various sort of notebooks full of ideas and possibilities set up by that constraint. And now the constraint's no longer there. I think it would be kind of interesting to go back to those ideas and think, well, what of that would still actually be really relevant and interesting to pursue now? I keep hoping for a sort of a big wave of humility in the arts, where the mainstream is more interested in really like the beauty of an economy of means, or different kinds of understanding of what beauty or aesthetics can be, more in terms of perhaps usefulness or social outcome. I mean, I'm still really interested in the whole Tania Bruguera thing of arte utile, one-to-one scale art, all these kinds of things. It's been a little bit depressing to see how quickly theatres are kind of back in the model of like, okay, we're going to start off with this new huge stonking production that costs like nearly $1 million to invite, and you know, this sort of very sort of the soft power cultural approach, cultural policy approach. Yeah, I keep hoping for that. And so in a way I was thinking, oh, maybe the pandemic can also be a chance to say again, you know, that the hardest hitting work can also be done with the smallest gestures, and the most and the kind of gestures that leave as little trace as possible on the planet and on each other in a detrimental way. That can be done with as much sensitivity as possible regarding colonialism or access, you know, and all these questions are there, I think, as well, embedded in the atlas, in the considerations especially.
Yep. I mean, they're both, I think, like, coming back to the atlas, I think the considerations are where a lot of the ethical grounding seems like for the project. And it's, in a way, actually, I think everyone that's going to be interacting with this conversation, either recorded or the live later, I would recommend, like, I feel like I'm going to record something like a screen kind of movement on the atlas to also add to the invitation of how to use it. But I feel like what's nice about it, and what I would conclude with in terms of at least my impression of it, is that it's not only, and you can't just enter it from different places, but I think based on what you're looking for, you would want to enter it in different places, regardless of how you entered it the first time. Like, it offers that. Maybe, I mean, you already know what I think about, like, where the design can go. The design feels very linear for what it wants to offer. But otherwise, just getting lost in it is just, I feel, very valuable, regardless of what people are going to get out of it.
Yes, thanks. That's great. I mean, there is also, when we launched it, we did 2 presentations, one for Vidy in Lausanne and another for Théâtre in Zurich. Those are still available online, I think. And it's all of us in the group guiding you through the atlas, showing you the
it's on the website
and so on. Yeah, so if you want, you can also just copy paste that and use it for your video. I'm sure that no one would mind.
That would be great. I mean, because with the about, there's the video that I found is the video of all of you writing your names in places.
No, that's just a little trailer that doesn't mean anything.
Anyways, if I don't find it, I'll ask you for the link.
Okay.
Awesome. That's been great. I hope you enjoyed it. I mean,
no, very much.
Yeah,
it was great to talk. Really great to talk.
And